Hi there, welcome to Nomadic Diaries. We're the podcast that takes you on journeys through the lives of those who have already embraced the international lifestyles. Whether you're an expat, a digital nomad, or someone who's dreaming of those lifestyles, this is your passport to a world of insight. We dive deep into the hearts and minds of the overseas lifestyle professionals, the authors, and researchers. Join us in this fun adventure as we deconstruct all the elements of expat and nomadic lifestyles, one captivating story at a time. Hi, listeners. Thank you for lending your ears today. It is my pleasure to introduce you to someone that I have known for about maybe 10 years, 8 years, Christopher O'Shaughnessy. Welcome, Christopher, today to Nomadic Diaries.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a joy and a privilege to be here.
Chris is a passionate and versatile speaker. You're going to discover that he has a great sense of humor. He's a comedian and he's an author. And he actually travels the globe assisting people in moving through their cross-cultural understandings and their international transitions. Chris has a podcast called Diesel and Clooney Unpack the World.
Yes, indeed.
So let's start there. Tell us about Diesel and Clooney Unpacking the World.
Oh, it's a fun podcast, and whenever I hear the title, read back to me, it reminds me that it's a silly title, but we went with it, and it sets the tone well because the podcast it's a little bit silly, but it's focused on expat issues and intercultural issues and things like that, all areas that you're very familiar with. But my good friend Jerry and I thought it would be fun to do a podcast with a couple of different perspectives. So Jerry grew up in one place for most of his life, and then as an adult jumped over to China. He just he thought he'd jump right in the deep end and move from the US to China, having never lived outside of the US, which takes a lot of guts. And so he brings the perspective of someone who grew up fairly monoculturally and then dove into this expat world. And then we contrast that with, I was born in the UK and just spent my whole life moving around. So, I was traveling from a very young age and moved quite a lot as a kid, and then just kept on moving as an adult. So the podcast is really sort of looking at issues through those two different lenses. What are the differences and similarities in the expat and international field from the perspective of someone who dove into it from a monocultural background, dove into it as an adult, and putting that together with the perspective of someone for whom that's just normal, that, the expat and international cross-cultural experience it's really all I've known. So it's a lot of fun. And Jerry does. He's got a fantastic sense of humor. We thoroughly enjoy it.
So both of you have a great sense of humor, and I enjoy listening to it. And I hope that we can inject some fun and some energy and some sense of humor, not only in this recording, but in all my recordings, because I think if we can laugh together, that really helps build the community and spreads good energy around the globe, even if we only laugh at.
Oh, it's very, very true. Well, and you remember things that make you laugh far better. So I think comedy is actually a really, really good teaching tool. And let's not kid ourselves. I think it's helpful if you can learn to laugh at yourself. That you learn a lot that way as well. Never take yourself too seriously. And in the cross-cultural and international and expat world, there's a lot to laugh at. There's a lot that you sort of have to reflect on. And if you don't laugh about it, you'll cry about it. And you probably need a bit of both.
Absolutely. Now tell me, where are you sitting today, Chris?
Today, I'm in Portland, Oregon, in the northwest of the US, and just flew here last night. So we're recording in the morning, actually at a very reasonable hour. I'm taking advantage of the fact that I'm a little bit jet lagged. I was in Europe. I was in the Netherlands for the past week. Just got to the US last night. And previous to that, I had another quick stop in the US. And previous to that, I was in Kenya, in Nairobi, Kenya for a couple of weeks. And so I don't really have a time zone anymore. I've sort of broken my internal clock, which tricks
Oh,
people around me into thinking that I'm very productive, that I'm a productive morning person, because the jet lag means I'll wake up super early, as if that's
yeah.
normal. It's not. I'm not naturally a morning person in the slightest. But it I get to fool everyone for a few days after a trip like that. Everyone thinks I'm super productive in the morning, and I'll go with it. I'd like people to believe that
Yes.
about me. So, jet
Yes.
lag has made me look like a morning productive person.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad that jet lag is serving you. I believe that jet lag actually has a purpose. One of the things I like to say about this podcast now is we're the place where stories wander around, but purpose finds its home.
Oh, which I love. That's such a good tagline, by the way. Such a good tagline.
You like that?
I do. I do. Approved at my level. Definitely approved at my level.
Oh, good.
I don't know how
And
useful that is, but there it is.
so I find that jet lag kind of puts me into a state of suspension. And when I'm in a state of mental suspension, I look at things differently. I notice my perceptions are changed. I notice that what I'm noticing is different. And
Ooh.
I think that movement really does this for us. Do you have any other sense of great uses for jet lag?
Oh goodness. Other than trying to fool people into thinking I'm a morning person, beyond that, I used to not be very sympathetic to it, to be honest. I think I'm for quite a while now, I've been relatively transient and sort of shifting time zones every couple of weeks. And I think that just sort of broke my internal clock. And it made me very socially dependent on my time cues. So I don't think internally my body knew when it was time to sleep. I would sort of just go by when everyone else slept and just kind of think, oh, is everyone sleeping? All right, I guess that's what we do now. And the same with food, just sort of think, is everyone eating? Okay, I guess I'll eat, rather than having a set schedule. And so I was so used to that if other people traveled, say to visit me, or I was meeting up with people and they were jet lagged, I was not very sympathetic, because I thought, oh, for goodness sakes, just push through, you'll be fine. But then, the pandemic happened and I had to stay put far more than normal. And I think I realize I might be a little bit on the excessive side of transient, in that the pandemic was the first time since I was about 8 years old that I'd been in one place sort of that long. And I think it was the first time since I was a teenager that I'd spent more than 90 days in the same country consecutively.
Oh my.
I hadn't spent 3 months in one country since I was a teenager.
That's really nomadic, listeners, just for a
Like,
second.
I may have, yeah, I may have taken it just a tad bit extreme, but so comparatively, then, having to stay put for more than 90 days. Oh, it was. I mean, that was a big shift in many many ways, but it did make me adapt to one time zone. And then when I finally started traveling again, oh, jet lag hit me hard, and I had so much more sympathy, and I was like, oh,
Yeah.
it really is a thing, if you
Yes.
if you let your time zone set. But I like what you said about using it as sort of a way to reflect, because it suddenly does make you realize the routines that you have, and we tend to take our routines for granted.
Yes.
We
We're on
There are
automatic
normal.
pilot. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, yeah, it is a good time to reflect on that. Like I said, when I'm faking being a morning person, I suddenly realize, yeah, there are people who just naturally do this. My wife is just naturally a morning person, and she can accomplish more before 9 a.m. That, at 9
Yes.
a.m., if I
Yeah.
had my way, by 9 a.m., I'd barely be functional. The pistons have only just begun firing. Yeah, I'm just far more of a night owl. But yeah, I think it is. It's kind of throwing you out of your routine is a great time to reflect on maybe what you take for granted.
Yes, I think it is. And I think that there's a lot can come out of that suspension if we examine it and reflect on it and record some of the crazy things that happen, or the crazy things that we think, because I think is part of the freedom that I find in travel is to be discombobulated, because it's like, no, they're so discombobulated that there are no tethers.
Mm.
Maybe that's a lack of mental health on my part. I hope not.
Well, no, I think it's just a perspective on, I think at its root is a thing that I think you notice a lot in the, cross-cultural field, and that is the human tendency to project, that we all project until we
Really?
know otherwise. So we assume the way we do things must be how everyone does them.
Yes.
And everything falls into that category for the most part until you're confronted with something different. And it's only then that you realize, oh, and so everything from, I think speech patterns are such a wonderful example of that. In English, for native English speakers, we tend to put a short pause between conversation with people. So I'll say my piece, and then there's a short pause, and then you say your piece. And that's
Yes.
considered polite. And we're like, oh, look, we're engaging, the conversation is flowing. But that is not universal. That is a distinctly, specifically English Western sort of thing. You move that to, say, Japanese, where it's considered polite to have a much longer pause. A
Exactly.
pause that would be uncomfortable for English speakers, but to
Mm-hmm.
Japanese speakers, that shows that you're paying attention and it shows respect. And then you switch that to, say, Italian, where you start speaking before the other person has finished speaking, and that's considered polite. That's keeping there should be no dead time. There should be no silence. And so if you transfer any of those without thinking about it, becomes weird. If we gave the
Yes.
same amount of pause in English that they do in Japanese, we would worry that the conversation's not going. We'd think, oh, am I boring? Because,
Mhm.
there seems to be a halt. And if you talked over each other, like in Italian, we would assume it's rude. We would think, well, you're not even listening to me. You're just waiting to talk. So things like that, I would never think about speech patterns not being universal. I would assume
Mm.
everyone must want a little tiny pause before they
Yeah,
speak. And it's only when you're confronted with something different that you realize. And I think even time is that way. The
it
jet
is.
lag maybe is a time to realize not everyone runs on the same schedule that we do. And so it's those little punctures in your routine that help show you, what you're projecting, maybe even inadvertently.
I believe that is sort of the part of the culture iceberg that pokes out above the clouds and that we take notice of. I mean, there's much
Yeah.
more going on underneath. What about our thinking? Because I have lived in Mexico now full time for 2 years, but off and on for about 6 years. I really try to practice what are they thinking? What is behind this? Not just be a superficial being. I'm really trying to take on that. And after spending 15 years in Saudi Arabia, wondering, my best skill, by the way, is to wonder.
That's a
To
good skill.
wonder. Is that a useful skill, do you think? Wondering?
Oh, I definitely do. I think I got to do some work with the European Commission, their intercultural approach program, which was fascinating. Just an amazing group of people, very clever people that I was
Yeah.
so fortunate to get to rub shoulders with. And it also gave me, phenomenal access to really experts and just very clever
Yes.
people. And commonly from the people that we interviewed, one of the most common traits as we were looking at, how do you increase your intercultural intelligence? How do you work cross-culturally? How do you do it
Mm-hmm.
well? And
Mm-hmm.
one theme that came up almost universally from the various experts that we were able to speak with was wondering, was curiosity. They said that,
Yeah.
really, if you want to improve your cross-cultural skills, curiosity is the way to go. There is a Professor Richard Harris. We got to speak with him, British, but has lived in Japan for years and has written phenomenal papers on, intercultural subjects. And that was one of the things he said was, your propensity for curiosity is usually a pretty good indicator of, how well you're going to do cross-culturally. And it can be
Yeah.
changed. If you want to increase your curiosity, one of the
Yeah.
side effects is you're probably going to do better interculturally. And
Yeah.
quite a few of our guests in that program, that was something that they shared. So I'm a big advocate for curiosity and wonder. I think they'll take you far.
I think that it's sort of the chicken and the egg, isn't it? Because
Mm,
I think that we're curious and that prompts a lot of wondering. And then we wander and we discover and we explore and we become more wondered and we wonder.
yeah.
And so those two words are very, in my mind, often are very conflated.
Yeah. Well, and again, I think it creates, sort of a virtuous cycle,
Exactly. Yeah.
you do one because of the other, which in turn causes the loop to repeat. And that is, I mean, there's plenty of negative cycles in life, so we should definitely do what we can to promote the virtuous cycles.
Oh, we should. We should. And we should recommend to all our listeners that just pay attention to what are you wondering about today or where are you wandering? Because I think there's a relationship. Back to Japan. and the idea of Japan. So my theory when I lived in Japan was that Japanese people were able to create space in their heads. I remember my husband would put up his arm in the subway and a little lady would be in here and his other arm. And I've told this story before, and a little old lady would be in here. And then he picked up a foot. Well, then he was really stuck because he was standing on one leg for the remainder of the journey. So, that's the biggest thing that I remember about Japan is that they have that propensity to create space in their minds. So is the fact that they do this internally and physically, is that what's being reflected in their speech patterns?
Oh, maybe. I mean, I wonder. I've been to Japan a few times, and I've always found it an absolutely fascinating place. And I think it's a combination of that creating space, and then tied with a theme that is an undercurrent, not just in communication, but I think in just approach. And that is, it's often said that Japan is very, very high context. And I think in that, you sort of have to create, not that you don't in other ways too, but in that I could see the correlation from being high context to also creating mental space. Just because if you function high context, you probably need a lot of space in your head to sort things out, because what you're finally outputting is usually more concise or more nuanced. And so the processing happens internally, and then what you output is sort of a final product. Whereas lower context, which I think it's very difficult having those terms. I mean, they're good terms, but I think they give us a bias to somehow think that, higher is better, lower is worse, which is absolutely not the case. They're just different.
Exactly. They're just terms. They're just terms. They're not relative at all.
No. But lower context, I think my assumption, or at least my observation, would be lower context is more external processing. So not that there isn't space internally, but you're using the space around you. You're sorting it out externally at the same time. And I think that even just the convergence of that, when you put low and high context together, is so interesting. I think the example I often think of is the very low context will just spell it out. The low context, if you're trying to get from A to D, low context will just say A, B, C, D. There it is. Higher context would say A, the number 3, L, T, P, Brown. And what comes next? And you go, and you have to think about it. And then Japanese is so high context that if they wanted to go from A to D, they would just show you a painting of a fish, and you're just supposed to know that fish represents an age-old tale that somehow relates to letter D.
Yes.
And we all function, on a different scale in there, whether we say it directly or we beat around the bush or we use total symbology. But think about how that must affect, the way we mentally process. And I think being an expat or a traveler, that's yet another one of those ways that we can notice what we project. You know what I mean? If you come from a low context culture, you probably assume, well, everyone just talks their thoughts out loud. They process verbally. If you're from a higher context culture, the assumption might be, well, no, you got to think it through before you speak. And I know for myself, sometimes I tend to, I started out schooling and everything in the UK, which is of the English speaking world, is more high context. And it's funny how much I notice that even in the way I process things. I'm not very productive in sort of meetings where you get a bunch of people, you say, all right, let's think this through together. Oh, I do terrible at that. I'm far more, I'm like, leave me alone a bit. Let me sort it out in my head, and then I'll bring you an idea. But I don't process out loud near as well, but some people do. And I do. Some of that I'm sure is personality, but there must be an influence there too in our communication styles, I think.
Yes, I believe that there are influences, and I notice I use more words. I grew up in Scotland, of course. Many more words in a sentence than is necessary. In American, even this morning on the pickleball court, we were doing a drill, and I'm going like, I got this. 1, and then it's 2, and then it's 3 over there, and then you do, and nobody else was talking. Just Doreen. I felt like I was the class clown again because it was a zigzag pattern, and we were supposed to communicate with our partner, but that's not normal in pickleball, that people really are talking out loud on the court, because it drives most people crazy. Not me.
But there's something to be said for, the appreciation of different styles. And maybe that's, I think, one of the greatest gifts of a cross-cultural experience is it it forces you outside of the normal, which helps you to pick up the different ways to do that. And there are benefits to all of it. There's, like I said, high and low context. There's certainly not one better than the other. Each come with their benefits, and you gain a much more rich set of tools when you are able to take in and benefit from. It may be more uncomfortable for me, but there is sometimes great benefit to talking your thoughts out loud, to to having just that, well, let's brainstorm sort of thing. There's benefit. It might not be my natural style, but there's great benefit to it. And I think the same thing with so many other cultural areas as well. I get made fun of quite a bit because I have to eat with cutlery. That's coming from, I started out in a very, very, very old-fashioned small English school in a tiny village that time forgot. And we, at lunchtime, the headmaster used to walk around, and you had to have cutlery in both hands, and you couldn't have your elbows too high. You certainly couldn't talk with your mouth full of food.
Yes.
And if he would patrol, and if at lunch the headmaster saw you with your elbows too high, or didn't have cutlery in both hands, or what have you, he would smack you on the back of the head, and then you had to stand, and you couldn't eat anymore. And anyway, it was this big embarrassing ordeal. And that stuck with me so hard that to this day, I'm desperately uncomfortable without cutlery in both hands. And I spend more and more time in the US. And in the US, there's a lot of, burgers, the pizza, and they just eat it with their hands, which is fine. Or, we've gone to restaurants where all they give you is a fork, no knife, just a fork. And I've taken to bringing emergency cutlery with me, because it's just, I will quite happily eat a burger with a fork and knife, or pizza with a fork and knife. And it goes back to, I'm just deathly afraid that my headmaster, even now, decades later, my headmaster,
behind you.
He's going to sneak out. He'll be waiting for me at that Pizza Hut. He knows. And so I want cutlery in order to be comfortable. But I've been to, in Ethiopia, you use your hands, and you sort of use the food to scoop other food. And obviously there's chopsticks. There's so many different ways to eat. And so to me, it is even in the US, learning to just pick up a burger with my hands may feel initially uncomfortable, but
I can't tell you how excited I am, because I hate buffets now. I hate being faced with big, old, sloppy, cold food that's getting cold, because I too have been trained in the art of cutlery.
It'd be a good title for a book, The Art of Cutlery.
Yeah, I've never had this conversation with anyone else, but my husband knows if it's a buffet, I'm like, I've got my arms crossed and I'm looking at it sideways, and I'm like, and nothing looks appetizing to me unless I have cutlery in my hands. So
the safety of cutlery.
Similar programming, different. It was in my house, but So isn't that fast? I'm so glad to know I'm not the only one.
No, we can start a support group. We think
we need one. I think we definitely need one. So that's kind of thrilling, actually, to understand that we all have these foibles, but actually some of our foibles are built-in culture that is invisible to our soul, really.
Yeah, it really is. And I tie it to, there's a fascinating book by, I always worry I pronounce his name wrong, Daniel Kahneman, I think. And the book is Thinking Fast and Slow.
Oh, yes. I have it on my bookshelf.
Yeah, it's a great book. It's a great book. He doesn't necessarily write about culture in that, but I think the tie into culture is really interesting. And the whole premise of the book is that we have fast thinking, which is pattern recognition, and then slow thinking, which is more critical analysis. And it's really interesting to see the divide and how that affects us. But you think about culture, and culture, I think in many ways, there's so many definitions of culture, but culture, I think in a lot of ways, it's the framework for how we do things. And culture is sort of what we move into the fast thinking, because culture we generally don't think about. It's just the lens through which we're interpreting reality. And what's really interesting is traveling and having international or cross-cultural experiences forces some of that fast thinking into slow thinking. That if you never ran into anyone who did it differently, if I'd have just stayed in a small village in England where everyone used cutlery like that because the headmaster beat everyone to submission, that would just be a pattern for me. I wouldn't think about it. I would go to eat and I would instinctively expect there to be a fork, a knife, and a spoon, and they'd be placed here and I'd use them. And it's not until you run up against, chopsticks, or, a burger was presented, but no cutlery. That you suddenly have to move that pattern recognition into critical analysis. And so much of cross-cultural living is just that, is
Exactly.
recognizing how much for you has just been a pattern that you then
Yes.
have to think about it much more slowly. I mean, everything we talked
Yes.
about, eating styles and speaking styles, but even foot traffic, which side do you tend toward? And
Yes.
for much of
Yeah.
the world who drives on the right, foot traffic generally follows that. So then
Yes.
you head to a
Yes.
country where drive on the left and foot traffic changes. And I've watched that one's always interesting to me because it's so easy to see. Tourists in
Yes.
London, they're walking into pedestrian and they're wondering, why is everyone in my way? And it's because in their mind the assumption is everyone is like me, and I don't know I'm doing it, but I tend to the right. These people are
Yes.
not, something must be wrong with them. And watching that light bulb go on and go, oh, I'm the one who's standing out. It's me. And
Yes.
that's that moment of switching from fast thinking, pattern recognition to slow thinking to have to analyze things. And I think it's a great discipline. It's a great discipline every now and then to move something into critical analysis. You
And
discover a lot more.
I think that you do discover a lot more. I also notice that we can play spot the tourist here. In my little city, there's about 250,000 regular residents, but for things like Dia de las Muertes, Day of the Dead, and Easter celebrations, it could swell to several thousand people, 2, 3, 4,000 people in the town,
Yeah.
at this little town. And just walking, you go, resident, tourist, not even Mexican and American or US or some other nationality, but resident. And then there's a recognition factor for the people who actually come from Mexico City. And there are cues, the height of the heels, some of the fashions, the particular kind of hat. I
Yeah.
mean, I love all these things. I mean, they're just,
Yeah.
they keep me entertained here. But also, I think they can be very instructive in how I live my life, to be more compassionate, more generous, and more stretched, more open to various ways of living life.
Absolutely. And that's just it. There are so many ways to live life. And I think as humans, we're naturally bad at balance. It's very hard, I think, for us as humanity to ever be balanced. We tend to just react. We
Right.
swing one side and go, oh, too far. And so
Yes.
we
Yes.
compensate and we end up missing the middle and swinging too far the other side. And life
Yes.
is just this pendulum. And so I think there's even in that, there's balance. I think being able to appreciate different ways to live doesn't necessarily mean embracing everything. I don't
No.
feel guilty for the fact that I really prefer having cutlery.
No.
I don't have to give that up. I'm perfectly
Yeah.
entitled as a human to have my preferences, but
Yes.
being able to balance that with saying just because that's for me doesn't mean it's for everyone, and being
Mm.
able to create space where I can say, look, you grew up with chopsticks, and I'll use them from time to time, and I'll enjoy the experience. But if I get back home, I'm quite happily going to get out my
Want your cutlery.
fork and knife. And so there's that balance of, I think sometimes we mistake the idea of living cross culturally for having to let go of everything and embrace everything. And I don't think it's that. I think there's a balance somewhere in there between
Yeah.
being able to appreciate and dip into other realms. But that doesn't mean you can't have your own realm as well. You don't have to give up who you are in order to appreciate who everybody else is as well. And that's a discipline, but it's a fun one to work on, I feel.
So you just said a lot there. You talked about this being a discipline, and you also talked about how we don't have to embrace all these cultures and take them on as our own. I would like you to perhaps say a few words about how about someone who's lived overseas in, say, 8 or 9 countries
Give or take.
for 5 decades and is still at it? I mean, there are some things that are very good for the soul, that are good for the body, that are good for the mind, that I couldn't possibly remember all of the experiences that I personally have been through. And I'm sure there are listeners here who are going, so how do you choose what to keep? How do you choose what to embrace? How do you recognize what is right for you to carry this process through your entire life so that it is part of your natural authenticity?
Oh, it's such a good question. I have the sincere benefit of getting to speak to younger audiences quite a bit. I get to work with quite a lot of schools, and some of the benefit of that is having to translate what can sometimes be complex thoughts and complex ideas, translate that into something easily understandable. And I think that's almost what this is. It's a very complex thing to try to work out,
Yeah.
what do you hold on to? What do you retain? What is yours? What is someone else's? Where's the overlap?
Yes.
That's complex. And so, at the risk of sounding too simplistic, I've tried my best to create imagery to make that complicated structure into something understandable. And I think my attempt has come at it through avocados, because avocados are great. They're great. I used to not think so, to be honest. I was for a good chunk.
Oh
I'd
my.
say until I was in my maybe mid to late 20s. I was not a fan. I did. It was mushy and horrible. But
I never saw
something,
one in Scotland. I never met an
yeah.
avocado in Scotland.
Yeah, never met an avocado in Scotland. There's another good title for a book. I've never met an avocado in Scotland. Uh, yeah, I wasn't a fan, but I am a fan now. I think they're great now. But avocados they're interesting because if you look at an avocado, it's the part that we eat is the mushy bit, and that's there's quite a thick layer of mushy, but they have a huge pit. I mean, an avocado pit or seed or pip or whichever, depending on where you're from, for how you label that, it's huge and it's really hard. It's really, I mean, it is formidable. But I think in some ways we all get to manage our own avocadoness. And in that, I mean, to be healthy, you need to have a core, a pit, a pip, what have you, that has a set and unchanging things within that core are constant. But then we do have an outer mushy layer that's malleable. And I think to be
Yeah.
healthy, the discipline is maintaining a proper balance there. And some of that really is learning to process and sort out, all right, what about me will be unchanging? What about me is malleable? Where's my avocado balance going to be? Because it's very unhealthy to be all mush. If you just change to whatever's around you, I mean, it can be very empty existence. That's the sort of
Very.
you can adapt so well, but then what do you do by yourself? I had someone
Exactly.
say that to me once. Said, I'm so good at adapting to who's around me. I can fit in anywhere, but I hate being by myself, because if I've got no one around me that I'm morphing to, then what am I alone? And our core needs to be able to show us who we are alone. So some things need to go in there. I think, our values, certain traditions, our belief system, that needs to be relatively core. But that allows room for, what's malleable. And I think dedicating time to figure that balance out is well worth the effort. And I think they work in conjunction with each other, that whatever, our core beliefs are, that's going to play out in the mushier bits, just may play out differently. For instance, if a core value is, I really want to do my best to always make people feel welcome. So that's core and unchanging. But that may look different in different ways. I think
Yes.
some of that is, for instance, I think the outplaying of that exceeds even the golden rule: do unto others as you'd want done unto yourself. Because that doesn't always work. You look at the difference just between, say, introverts and extroverts. Despite what it might look like from the job I do, I'm actually quite introverted. So
Mm.
if I'm stressed, I actually just want left alone. If I've had a bad day, I just
Yes.
want left alone to sort myself out and take a
Yes.
break. However, some of my closest friends are very extroverted, and if they're having a bad day, they want someone to go through it with them. They want to talk it out. They want to be distracted. That's the time to socialize. And so you can't just do, if my inner core says make people feel welcome, then the outplaying of that might be mushy. So the core doesn't change. I do want people to feel welcome, but how that plays out might be different in different cultures. So for my
Yes.
friends who are extroverts, I can't just treat them like I would want to be treated, because they would feel abandoned. They'd say, look, I'm
Right.
stressed. Why are you leaving me alone right now?
Right.
Whereas the flip side, if I were stressed, the last thing I'd want is someone to be like, look, I've invited a load of friends around to distract you. I think, why do you hate
Party
me?
time. Yes.
Why? But it is, and I think, that to me is where the discipline comes in, is realizing, all right, if you have your core values that don't change, what does that look like in different situations? Because you can't compromise all of your principles. If a core value is, and that's where it gets interesting. If a core value is honesty, then what do you do when you're in cultures where bribery is just a normal part
Normal
of the
thing. Yeah.
system?
Yes.
And so
Yes.
I think you have to take the time to work that out. That if your
Yes.
core system is honesty, what does that actually look like in different cultures? Because
Yes.
everything will look different in different cultures. Being an introvert or extrovert looks different in different cultures. Communicating honestly looks different in
Yes.
different cultures. And Japanese, it's very rare to directly say no. You wouldn't do it. A no in Japanese is, well, we'll see. And you just have to know that that means no. So if your core value is honesty, that's going to have to translate differently. That the Japanese are not being dishonest. It's just the mushy part of that culture says this is how we express that honesty. And you get to practice that so much more in cross-cultural experiences, figuring out where your mushy bit and your core bit are.
So would you say that living cross-culturally, traveling, and for listeners who are considering launching themselves into this serial lifestyle or who have been in it for a long time, what would you say to them is the essence?
Oh, goodness.
Hard.
I know it is hard. I'm not great at being concise, so I'll do my best. I would say some of the essence really is just a summation of all of that, really. That some of the essence is learning that there's more ways to see the world and interact in the world. There's more culture, there's more normal than you think. And that so much less than you may realize is actually universal. So everything we take for granted, so much less of it is universal. We just assume everything. And that's human. That's, again, that book, Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, we're built for pattern recognition. So it's perfectly fine to look for patterns. Don't beat yourself up about it. Just be open to the fact that there are going to be so many more patterns that you realize, and that your routine and what you think is normal has value and has served you well. And if you're willing to jump into another set of routines, you increase your palette. And maybe that's the essence of it, is being willing to be open to increasing the palette with which you paint and which you see the world. If you suddenly are aware of more colors, it makes life more vibrant. That's a lot more work. You gotta make room on your palette. You gotta decide which colors. Again, it's perfectly fine to have a set of colors that you're most familiar with based on your upbringing or what have you. But it certainly doesn't hurt to go, oh, there's other ways to do it. Not everyone is a morning person. Not everyone is an extrovert. Not everyone is and you don't even have to live cross-culturally to experience that. But I think doing so cross-culturally is more vibrant. I think it's easier to notice. Those differences are less subtle.
It builds more liveliness, doesn't it? I love what you said, there's much less that is universal than we think, because that makes me think about, well, there's really not that much that is universal, except I'm thinking of some of the laws of the universe, like gravity.
Yeah, we can't escape that one. And that's just it. There are universal things.
There are, but there aren't really that many that apply everywhere all over the globe, are there?
No, there's not. And it is, I think adjusting your attitude to be shocked and delighted by that rather than horrified and offended. Again, my upbringing taught me that queuing is the way to go. You respect the queue. My goodness. Violating a queue is reason for extradition and banishment. Shot. Yeah. Yes. But that's absolutely not universal. So I go to the parts of the world where queuing is not a thing. It's mob mentality. It's, I'm back here and what I want is over there. So I'm just going to go as close to there as I physically can and move people out of my way if I have to. And that's some people's norm. And so it is a discipline for me to realize, okay, I can interpret everyone not queuing as being incredibly rude. That's because I'm universalizing my standard. Or I can be shocked and delighted by it. Like, oh, well, this will be a fun game. All right, I too will throw myself into the mix. Let's play along. Right. It is, adjusting your attitude. But we do. It's perfectly fine to assume that queuing is the norm if that's been your norm. But it adds a fun new context. I mean, because even that, you look at the side effects of that, and it affects how you socialize. That for standing in a queue, you have a predetermined set of people that you can choose to socialize or keep your distance from. In cultures where it's more mob mentality, you have an awful lot more interaction. It's funny how many things link onto even something as simple as how we queue or don't.
Well, this has just been a fascinating conversation with so many truth bombs, reality moments, and not some purposeful wandering, which I have really enjoyed, Chris. For our listeners who would love to be following Diesel and Clooney unpack the world, but moreover, who are interested in following you, where can people find you?
Oh, that's
put all this in the show notes.
I've tried to consolidate it. So probably the easiest way to follow me or get in touch or find out what I'm doing is my website, which is www.chris o.com, because my surname is O'Shaughnessy and no one in their right mind is ever going to spell that out. So there's hidden G's and H's that you'd never even imagine.
Yes.
So I just shortened it. So chris-o.com. And from there, that's where you can get in touch with me or see where I'm speaking and working. Also links to the Diesel and Clooney podcast and other things I'm working on there as well. Links to my book. Yeah, I think the website should be a centralized point for all of it, hopefully.
Oh, this is terrific. Well, thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, but most of all for the valuable, really golden nuggets that you've given us today in terms of the humor and the very human perspective that you bring to living interculturally. We're truly grateful that you came on the show today. Thank you so much, Chris.
Oh my gosh, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. And I do look forward to getting to chat and dialogue some more. It's been meaningful wandering. I like that. It's such a good phrase. I love a good meaningful wander. I really do. So thanks for the opportunity.
You're so welcome. Thank you.